All right. Great. So welcome to Talking Data Equity. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder of a project called We All Count. And We All Count is a project for data equity, a project for equity in anything having to do with data, whether that is a little tiny grassroots community organization doing a one-off project to see who's attending a program or accessing their resources, or whether it's like a giant multi-million-dollar continuous improvement project across a whole bunch of government agencies. Any project that's using quantitative data needs to pay attention to the way that it's using quantitative data and pay attention to how the use of quantitative data in your projects aligns with the intended experience of people that you care about, because it is very, very easy to accidentally double down on the human issues that you really care about by making choices, mathematical choices that aren't in alignment with the reason that you're doing the project. And so these mathematical choices have huge human consequences. And that's kind of at the heart of data equity, getting to learning, growing your ability to pay attention to the choices that we make all along the evidence generation process, and learning how to make those choices so that they prioritize the points of views, the lived experiences, and the communities that you are trying to make meaning for, make meaning with, and center in the work that you're doing. So that's what We All Count's about, and that's why we are here. And one of the things, probably one of my very favorite things that the We All Count team does, is most Fridays we gather together at noon our time. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. So we gather together at noon our time in Toronto, Canada, to have an informal conversation about topics related to data equity, practical topics, specific how-tos, and all of the rest. And sometimes at Talking Data Equity, we have like a topic that we have chosen in advance, and sometimes we have a special guest. And today we have a topic that we've chosen in advance. We are actually going to talk together today about how to make meaning from small populations and small sample sizes. So we've been asking the participants who attend regularly, what is it that you want to talk about? What is it that you are struggling with? And one of the very, very common answers is, I am struggling with how to make meaning for small populations and small sample sizes. So we're going to talk about that today. And what this looks like logistically is I'm going to talk for hopefully a short amount of time. I'm going to kind of gauge the level, because of course we have people here who are just getting started working with quantitative data, and we have people here who are very advanced at working with quantitative data. So we're going to try and have some conversations for both. And I'm going to present some slides, and then we are just going to open it up for your questions and your answers. Like, this isn't, I'm not here as like the person with all the perfect answers. This is a conversation amongst all of us. I'm just going to share some slides to kind of set the tone and kick us off. And the answer to the question, will the slides be shared, is no, the slides aren't going to be shared, but the video is going to be shared. And the reason for that is the video with the slides helps keep everything in context, and the slides without the questions and the talking are very easy to accidentally use out of context. So what do we actually mean when we are talking about small populations and small sample sizes? Let's look at an example. Let's say that we're doing a project, and our project is trying to understand how likely someone is to say that they had a positive experience at our hospital. And let's say that we want to break out that answer by sexual orientation. We want to know how likely somebody is to report a positive experience at our hospital by sexual orientation. We want to know this for a variety of reasons, so we can hold ourselves accountable, so we can make changes in the way that we might deliver our services, and so that we can have equity, hopefully, eventually, in client-patient experiences at our hospital. And let's say this is the report that we produce. A person who says that they're heterosexual are 83% likely to say that they had a positive experience at our hospital. A person who said they're homosexual is 81% likely to say that they have a positive experience at our hospital. And a person who self-identified as bisexual or asexual, the results for those people aren't statistically significant. Now, this is a very common report that comes across my desk all the time. And there is an equity issue here. And that is the fact that the experiences of people who identified as bisexual and asexual in this report are being suppressed. And they're being suppressed in a very specific way. We're saying that they are not statistically significant. Of course, there are numbers behind those words. We do have data from people who have said that they're bisexual and asexual, 84% and 32%. So there are numbers there. And one of the reasons that those numbers got suppressed at the beginning in the first report we saw is that those groups of people, we have a small number of them. We have only 24 respondents that told us they were bisexual. We have only 13 respondents that said they were asexual. And why do we care? Like, so what? Why does that make the numbers that come from these responses any different than the numbers that come from the 1,762 respondents and the 153 respondents? Why does it matter? Well, there's a couple of ways it matters, but one of the ways that it matters is that sometimes, not every single time, but sometimes when we have results from smaller groups of people, we'll have a greater level of uncertainty. So we're not going to go into an in-depth technical definition of uncertainty here or what a confidence interval is, but basically it's what a plausible range of the real truth is, the truth of the experiences. And sometimes if we have a lower number of people, like we have a lot less people who said they were asexual than people who said they were heterosexual in our data, we might feel like, well, we're pretty sure that the real experience, the real percentage of people who are having a positive experience at our hospital who identify as asexual is 32% plus or minus 22%. So maybe somewhere between 10 and 54%. That's one of the reasons that we might do a report like this. It's certainly not the only reason, and it isn't always the best reason or the right reason. This is not a mathematical inevitability. So at the beginning of today, remember when I said choices matter? Choices have human consequences. Sometimes we have a habit of anytime we see a small population, we think, well, that's not going to be a good number. We have to suppress that. Sometimes that's a great choice. Sometimes that's a terrible choice, but it's not a mathematical inevitability. The uncertainty in this example isn't an inherent feature of having a specific sexual orientation. And the uncertainty doesn't mean that the number doesn't matter. Neither of those things are like absolute truths that we all must follow. So what we're going to talk about today is what happens when we do have a small sample or a small population or a small group of people. And there's lots of different ways we might get that small number of people. Maybe there just are a few of the people that we are interested in making meaning for. Or maybe there's a big group of people, but we only collected data from a small amount of them. So there's lots of different ways to get a small group of people. But the question we're going to talk about today is, okay, what are we going to do now? Now that we have this small group of people? And there's a couple of considerations, a couple of things to think about when you're deciding, okay, what am I going to do? And the first thing to consider is, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to describe the experience of people that are coming into your hospital, in our example? Are you trying to take information or data from this sample of people and kind of generalize to a much larger group of people? Those are just two of many things that you might be trying to do. And this is a really important question. Before deciding, oh, I have 20 people in my sample, I have to do this. What you have to do very much depends on what you are trying to do. Second consideration is, what's the issue with smallness? Smallness is not an inherent problem. There's not a rule written in the sky that says, if you have less than 5 people, if you have less than 15 people, if you have less than 30 people, if you have less than 100 people, whatever kind of rule of thumb you might have been taught, that is not written in the sky as an inevitable mathematical fact. It really depends. Whether you have a small number of people depends. So let's talk about consideration number one. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do with this data from a small population or a small sample size? 4 of the things that are really common that you might be trying to do is decide in advance how to choose a sample size, what kind of statistical power your research might have. So statistical power, again, whole long conversation, but basically it is, how good is your research that you're planning going to be at kind of capturing the answer that you're trying to capture? You might be trying to take the data you have and talk about a bigger group, ask a few people in a state some question and try and make meaning about the whole state. Maybe you're trying to understand the experience or outcome of the people you have data for. Maybe you have a classroom of kids and you just want to understand what's going on in that classroom. You're not trying to talk about a whole school or other classrooms, or maybe you're trying to compare 2 people. These are 4 very common things that you might be trying to do. So that number 1, deciding what statistical power your research might have. Statistical power matters before you have collected your data. So statistical power is really important if you're writing a grant or if you're designing a project and you're trying to decide, how many people do I need in my sample? Once you have your data, if somebody hands you a data set that has a small sample size in it, you don't have to worry about the statistical power that it may or may not have. You can just do your analysis and it will tell you whether or not you've found an effect. So statistical power only matters before you've collected your data. Once you have your data, if you have data with a small group of people or a small sample size, you don't really have to worry about power calculations. So that leaves us with, 3 other things, which is, maybe you're trying to understand the experience or outcome of the people that you have data for. If that's what you're trying to do, for example, you're trying to understand what's going on in a classroom of children, and you have data for all those children in your classroom, and you're not trying to take that data and describe what's happening in other classrooms, again, the size of your sample doesn't matter. So sometimes people think, there's only 30 young people in my classroom. 20 of them are girls, 10 of them are boys. I can't make meaning because those numbers are too small. Not true. If you're just trying to explain what's going on in your classroom, your sample size is not going to be a big issue. You can simply describe what the data says. So we're going to take that out for the purposes of today. And now we're down to 2 things. If you're trying to take the data you have and talk about a bigger group, so take a sample, talk about a population, or you're trying to compare 2 groups of people. Small sample sizes are going to be an issue here. You're going to have to think about stuff here. So when you're talking about the data you have, and then hoping to bring it to a bigger group, you're going to go from a sample to a population estimate. Maybe you want to know how many people in your community have HIV. You're not going to have the resources to ask every person in your community. So you're going to somehow get data on a sample of people and take the results from that sample and try and make an estimate about how many people in my entire community have HIV based on the data I have. Sample size is really going to matter to try and answer that question. Compare two groups of people on a metric. So maybe you're trying to compare in a country, how likely are people who are born here versus people who immigrated here? How likely are those two people to have a job that they like? When you're looking for a difference between two groups of people, sample sizes are going to matter then. Or maybe you're looking for an effect. You know, did our new medicine work? Did our new policy work? Are things changing over time? When you're looking for those kind of differences, again, sample sizes are going to matter. So first consideration is don't assume that your sample is too small for what you're trying to do. Think about what you're trying to do. Second thing is smallness is not inherently bad. You want to think, what specifically am I worried about because I have a small number of data points? Am I worried about accuracy? Accuracy is how close it is likely that your measurements are going to give you a result that is the actual true value. Now, that's a funny thing, because if we knew the actual true value, we wouldn't need to do the analysis. So this is a philosophical thing. Accuracy is philosophical, but important because we want accurate results. Like, we're using data to get accurate, meaningful results. So if you are worried about accuracy, there's going to be certain things that you're going to need to do with your small sample size. Or maybe you're worried about precision. And precision is to do with stability. So if you're trying to find out how many people in your state have HIV and you take a couple of different samples, how different are those samples going to be is one way to think about precision. Again, these are complicated terms that we could spend, a month talking about. But basically, that's what we mean by precision. Certainty, that has to do with how likely are we to have an accurate, a real answer, an answer that is, shall we say, useful. There are ways to, I'm going to combine this with plausible range, which is next. So plausible range is like the confidence intervals. And both certainty and plausible range and confidence intervals, those calculations already account for your sample size. So you can calculate a confidence interval with a very small sample size. That's going to be fine. Last thing I'm going to talk about is relative size. If you want to hear a lot about statistical significance and p-values and relative size, if you're trying to look at a difference between a small group of people and a big group of people, you are definitely going to have to pay attention and make some adjustments for your sample size. So before you even try and jump into what corrective action am I going to take that I have a small group of people, think about these considerations and think about, A, does it really matter if I have a small group of people? And B, what is it specifically that I'm trying to make sure I attend to because I have a small group of people? Accuracy, precision, certainty, plausible range, relative size, or a combination of the two. Like, it's not just one, you might have several. But it's really important to have a very clear idea about what you're trying to do. Then, once you have those two options, once you have those two considerations worked out, you have lots and lots of options. And I see that people are talking about anonymity in the chat. And absolutely, anonymity is a real and true issue with small sample sizes. And however, also double check that the way that you're going to use the data does actually pose a privacy risk. Privacy is incredibly important. We cannot overemphasize how important it is that we don't expose personal details or personal identifying details. But there are lots and lots of ways to take a small sample and present results from that small sample that aren't like just a count that's going to become very easy to identify a child in a school or an employee in an office. So let's look at some of the options that you have. One of the options is you can just stick to the rules. You can stick to pre-established rules and not make meaning for small sample sizes. Another option you have is figure out ways to increase the sample size, increase the number of data you have using additional resources. Option 3 is take kind of frequentist parametric methods, which are what most people these days refer to when they're talking about statistics. We'll talk about details in a second, but like basically option 3 is use a method that you know with some adjustments. Option 4 is there's some very good Bayesian parametric methods that incorporate prior knowledge. We'll talk about that. And then option 5 is probably the most commonly used, which is non-parametric methods. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go very quickly through these methods. And to answer a question in the chat, yes, we will be putting resources and links to a lot more information on these methods up in our community forum, along with the recording of this, because what I want to do is just give you enough information that you can go find answers and that we can have a conversation for the rest of this hour. So I'm not going to be teaching you in depth how to do each of those methods. I'm going to be just putting a pin in each of these methods so that once you are working on your problem and you think this method might help me, you can remember the name of it and find some resources. So option 1, obviously, stick to the pre-established rules, which means you probably won't be using your small population sample sizes. This works well if you are only interested in results for large dominant groups. This has some very serious downsides, however. It perpetualizes the marginalization of small populations and hard to reach populations. I'll put up a fantastic talk by Abigail Echohawk from the Seattle Urban Indian Health Institution about how, in her opinion, refusing to make meaning from small sample sizes, especially small populations of American Indians or First Nations or Indigenous people, perpetuates a form of data genocide. Very powerful video that I recommend watching. It also gives arbitrary power to people who decide what data projects get done or don't get done. And that's a real power problem, which is at the heart of data equity. People who decide that these results, we don't even get to see those results. Like if we think back to the hospital patient experience that I started with, even though there was a very small number of people who said they were asexual, even with the big confidence interval, that number had meaning and that number pointed to an issue. And so the fact that somebody gets to decide that that number shouldn't be seen or consumed is a power issue and is not inevitable. Yes, good. Okay. Abigail Echohawk fans in the room for sure. Okay. Option 2 is very interesting. You can take the sample that you have and you can use additional resources and analytic methods to make it bigger. One of the things you can do is you can build a comparison group using historical data. Another thing you can do is called integrative analysis. So if you want to build a comparison group using historical data, there are growing ways to do this. In healthcare, for example, there are registries, there are natural history studies, and there are other research that often collect data from very similar populations and ask really similar questions. And there's an emerging field in which people test the validity, they figure out the ways to start controlling for, of course, the bias that is going to be present when we use a different data set. But the good thing about using historical data is that you can use frequentist methods or you can use Bayesian methods. The way that you actually analyze historical data in combination with the data that you're looking at is very, very flexible. And there's emerging ways that you can do that that are really intelligent, that kind of borrow the most information from the data that's most like the data you have. And I'm going to talk about a real world example of that in just one second. This is not exactly the same as integrative data analysis, but it's very similar. Integrative data analysis is basically using two simultaneous data sets and combining them. And I will give you a link to an example of this that's pretty recent, where researchers were trying to get estimates about people with disabilities. And there was a very small group of people that they had data on. And so what they did was they took the American Community Survey, which is a big survey in the United States, that asks really interesting questions, but isn't representative at small areas. And they combined it with the data set called Survey of Income and Program Participation, also an important survey in the United States. And they combined the information from these two surveys, not knowing, this wasn't linking data. They couldn't say, oh, this person answered this question and that same person answered this question. So these were not linking the surveys. They combined the information from these two surveys, and they were able to get, just to sum it up very plainly, they were able to get results that were like 19% more informative. So a link to that is coming your way. And the pros of option 2, which is kind of using data that already exists to kind of pad the sample size that you have. One of the real advantages is it lowers participant burden among marginalized and oppressed populations. The fact that we try and collect data from people who are from disability groups, from First Nations groups, from very, very nuanced racial groups, from very specific socioeconomic groups, that is asking marginalized people to contribute data over and over and over again. As we develop ways to use data that they've already contributed, this is a pro, this is a win for equity. Some of the downsides is that even when we're looking for data to combine, there's lots of populations that are you're just not going to find enough data in this way. And this puts the onus to change on individuals rather than research institutions. This doesn't fundamentally change some of those sample size protocols that exist in institutions. Con, but not an insurmountable con. Okay, so option 3 is take a frequentist methods, and frequentist methods are things that you've probably heard of, like regression, ANOVAs, things like that, and make adjustments. There are things like finite population adjustments. A finite population adjustment takes into account the fact that if you have 50 responses from the white people in your community and 50 responses from the First Nations people in your community, you have in my community, I would have a much higher proportion of representation from the First Nations people in my community. That needs to be accounted for. So 50 responses is not the same for every single population. We can adjust this. Finite population adjustment is very straightforward. You can do it in Excel. You can do it by hand. Multi-level models, very popular frequentist method. I'm going to give you a link in the resources to some fairly recent research that shows that the sample size that we think we need is actually much lower than what was previously thought, because in multi-level models, parameters, estimates can borrow from other estimates. Using different types of likelihood, is very useful if you have a small sample size. Trimming survey weights. So survey weights is something that I know a lot of you want to talk about. And a survey weight is something that helps you account for the fact that the people that you have data from are representative of a lot of other people. So if I'm trying to figure out if we should get a new dog park or a new pool in my neighborhood, and I'm collecting survey data, and I'm collecting survey data from people who are over 40, and I'm collecting data from people who are under 40. And just because of the way I'm collecting data, I end up with a lot more data from people who are over 40, overrepresented. I can wait. So that means that I can say, not 10%, like 30% of my data is from people who are under 40 years old. But in my community, 60% of the people in my community are under 40 years old. I need to take each of those responses from the people under 40 and actually make them count for 1.5 responses. So we bump it up a little bit. And that number, 1.5, is called a survey weight. And again, I am vastly oversimplifying. There are, very simple and very complicated ways to get survey weights, but paying attention to those survey weights is one way you can deal with the fact that you have a small sample. And trimming those survey weights, trimming means deciding that what the biggest survey weight you're willing to have will be. All right, great. People keep sharing fabulous resources in the chat, and we'll take those resources from the chat and we'll put them in the community forum. Okay, so some of the pros to these frequentist methods with adjustments are that these are very conventional approaches. Your colleagues, your friends, your bosses, if you're an academic, people who might look at your peer-reviewed papers, they're probably going to be used to seeing these approaches. They're going to know how to think about them. They're going to know how to make sense of the results. Cons is that frequentist approaches still, even with all these adjustments, most of the time produce much better evidence for large dominant groups. And continuing to just crank on frequentist parametric methods can be seen as a barrier to innovation. All right. Option 4, Bayesian, we're going to do next Friday, a whole hour, starting from very basics to some advanced. What is a Bayesian method? But essentially, a Bayesian method is different in frequentist methods in that it takes information up front. A Bayesian method asks you up front, what do you think is a plausible result? What has your experience told you? What has your community's experience told you? What has past research told you? And because this Bayesian method asks you that question up front and then incorporates that prior knowledge into what's called a posterior, which is a result, it doesn't matter as much that you have a small sample size. Bayesian methods are one of the strongest and definitely most commonly used best practices right now in dealing with small sample sizes. And they're really good for equity because not only can they deal with the fact that you might have a small group of people, they also, when they're making those adjustments, instead of like using frequentist statistical weights or bringing in data from another survey, the way that they kind of bulk up that small sample is by asking people who have the lived experience that you're trying to understand how that small sample size should be bulked up. So in that way, Bayesian methods are great for equity and small sample sizes at the same time. It avoids the p-value problem that almost always favors those big dominant groups. We have a video on that if you want to hear more. And Bayesian methods work well in situations where privacy is an issue, which I know has already come up in the chat. So because you can add prior information, The privacy issues are often mitigated when you use a Bayesian method. Cons are it can still be quite challenging right now to find an analyst who can use Bayesian methods. They're still pretty new, and you have to have a pretty powerful computer. It takes like a lot of thought on a computer's part to do these Bayesian methods. All right, last one we're going to talk about, then I'm going to just open it up to your questions, are non-parametric methods. And so non-parametric methods, for people who are like, what the heck is that word? Non-parametric methods are not as horrible or boring as their name sounds. Essentially, and again, this is not a course on non-parametric methods. There are courses on non-parametric methods. If you want them, they're fantastic. Essentially, most of the other methods we're talking about, regressions, ANOVAs, even many of the Bayesian methods, taking an average, even, for example, those have a lot of assumptions baked into them. They have assumptions about what that data looks like in the real world. And often, this is violated with a small sample. Often one of the big problems with the fact that you have a small sample isn't that it's small, it's that parametric methods make a lot of assumptions that you can't validate with a small sample. So one of the alternatives is you use something called a non-parametric model. A non-parametric method doesn't assume that your data came from like a distribution or a pool of data in the world that looks like this very, very specific fancy way. It doesn't make a lot of assumptions about what the world looks like. Non-parametric methods let the data tell you what the world looks like, rather than parametric methods, you kind of tell the model what the world looks like. It can be thought of as allowing the data to inform our knowledge about what the world looks like. And they work really well lots of times for small data sets. Very, very simplified idea is that parametric methods can be thought of as using averages or means. Non-parametric methods often use medians. And I will give you a link if you want to know what the difference between a mean and a median is. Some names for non-parametric methods, and they're kind of parametric sisters. If you're used to doing a t-test, which is a lot of what regressions kind of do, you can use a Mann-Whitney U-test. Paired t-test means, you know, two groups, you're comparing two groups. Wilcoxon-signed rank test, one-way ANOVA, Kruskal-Wallis test. And the good news is that these are not hard to do. You can even do these by hand if your sample size is small enough. Excel can do them. Lots and lots of other kind of programs can do them. And if you have a teeny tiny data set, there's something called the Fisher exact test, which can also help you make meaning in places that you really need to make meaning. Lots of pros. Non-parametric methods have been around for a very long time, so they're not going to seem new or weird to most of your colleagues or reviewers. It uses that median, not an average, which is, even if you have a big sample size, sometimes actually a better answer to your question. You don't have to take out outliers. One of the real equity issues in small and large data sets is that you have to remove outliers. You don't have to remove outliers here. Some of the cons are they're very more sensitive to differences in variability. In other words, if you're trying to find out on a scale of 1 to 10, how good a person's experience was at your hospital, and they're just all over the place, that's going to be hard for a non-parametric model to handle. Not impossible, just harder. And if you're used to comparing your results with other people's research or other people's data projects who are using averages, not medians, you're going to have a very hard time. Okay. Yeah, link is definitely going to be put up with the video about what's an average and what's a median. So we have talked about 5 options. Once you've figured out, okay, what is it that I'm actually trying to do with this small sample? And then thought about, well, am I worried that the sample is small just because, you know, some professor has put the fear of small samples into me?
Is this small sample really a problem? If so, what aspect of its smallness is a problem? And then once you've thought about those things, there's at least 5 kind of big buckets of options that you can use to get something that's more accurate, or get something that's more precise, or get something that protects the privacy of the people involved, or get something that allows you to figure out what is a pretty good estimate of what's going on in this population, even though I only have a little bit of data. So, of course, in 1 hour, we cannot go through every possible option and every technical detail of the option. But what we're trying to do here is give you some practical, something to grab onto when you are faced with this problem, which we almost all are. WeAllCount.com is kind of the digital home of all of this material if you want to hear more. And if you forget how to get to the community, WeAllCount.com has a link at the top in the menu that will help you get to the digital community. Okay. Now, there are many, many, many questions in the chat. Let's see. Yes. So we will I'll say this right now. We will certainly not get to all the questions, but there is a place that we can get to all the questions, and that is in the community forum. When we put the video up, it will go in this forum, and the We All Count team, myself included, is in that forum every day. And so if your question doesn't get answered, feel free to ask your question again in that community forum. And not only will the We All Count team answer, but a lot of the people who are here will also add their resources and their expertise, because it absolutely takes a community to deal with small sample sizes and equity. I'll just start right now with a huge important comment in the chat, which I love, which says, this is a great time to shout out qualitative data. And of course, qualitative data is an excellent way to know things. Quantitative data is one way, and one way that often has very, very many problems in the way it tries to get answers. So small sample sizes can even be thought of as qualitative data many times. And for sure, adding a qualitative component to your quantitative work is a fantastic idea. And I see lots of people in the chat are saying that, and I wholeheartedly agree. Adding a layer of qualitative data is an excellent way to make meaning for small sample sizes. And it's also an excellent way to make meaning for large sample sizes. So I guess one of the reasons I didn't add qualitative here is that I think it's an excellent way for everything. Okay. Oh, great. Somebody's asking a really, really good question, which is, if Bayesian analysis incorporates subjective prior knowledge, why should we trust the results? I love that question very much. And the answer is that frequentist methods also incorporate opinions and subjective choices. They just don't do it in a transparent way. So the idea that frequentist methods are objective and Bayesian methods are subjective is a commonly held misunderstanding. And I think if you spend a little while on the We All Count website or looking at other talking data equity videos, you'll see that there's lots and lots of ways that subjectivity is also built into frequentist. And one of the advantages of Bayesian, we'll talk about this next week, is that some of the ways that prior knowledge or subjectivity is baked into Bayesian analysis is done so in a way that you can see it, and therefore you can decide if you want to trust it or not, rather than the frequentist methods where it's often much more implicit or hidden, and so you don't get to decide. Okay, some people, bootstrapping. Okay, bootstrapping is a very important topic. So bootstrapping is not exactly Bootstrapping needs to be used with a great deal of care if you're using it as a correction for small sample size. So we'll also give you a resource for bootstrapping here, but bootstrapping is essentially, another word for bootstrapping is resampling. So you take the data that you have and you basically draw a couple of balls out of the the bingo pot of your data. You draw some balls out, you put them into your analysis, then you put the balls back in and you draw another set of balls out. It is a very important and a pretty easy to do method. It doesn't fix the small sample size a lot of the time. So I'm going to add some resources to that, but it's definitely something to consider. That's a very good addition. Okay, here's a really interesting question. When we're collecting data, sometimes we create small groups within that data in the way that we cluster. So in other words, if we're collecting data by age, and we cluster people into 20 and under, 30 to 50, 50 to 70, and 70 and over, we're creating a small group of people in that 70 and over in our data set because we just don't have that many people who are 70 or over. That is a fantastic, fantastic comment, because that comment gets to the equity issue that's at the heart of a lot of the small sample sizes, which is that we created them. Like we chose to collect data in such a way that if we use conventional methods, we're likely to get much more certain or much more accurate or much more precise information for this big dominant group that we created. And that's not an inherently bad thing to do. That's not a problematic thing to do by definition, but it can create equity problems. If the purpose of your project is to actually understand as many people as possible and a wide distribution of the experience that people of different ages are having, maybe creating those clusters to not have those extremely small sample size problems would be a good first step. So I'm so happy you said that, because sometimes people are dealing with small sample size problems because they created them. And if you can figure out how to not create them, you don't have to worry about the small sample size problem. Excellent. Some great comments on Bayesian analysis. I highly recommend you come next Friday if you want to have a conversation about Bayesian analysis, because that's the topic of data equity next Friday. I'm looking for other questions. Okay. So there are some questions here about who should and should not be combined. So in other words, if we're collecting sexual orientation data, is it okay to combine everybody that doesn't say that they're heterosexual into one big group? Or is that not okay? Is that equitable or is that not equitable? Answer to that question is it depends. And there isn't a single right answer. Sometimes it's really important to create a big group of people who's going to have a lot of certainty and precision, and therefore a lot of power in a data-driven world. And sometimes it's more equitable to generate nuanced information about the specific lived experiences of people who have more distinct subpopulations within that larger group. So there isn't a rule about how you have to or how you cannot aggregate or collapse data. But when you're doing it, think about the consequences of that. Okay, somebody's asking where this is going to be. I'm going to give you the community link one more time. This video will be posted in the Talking Data Equity section of that online forum. It's not a membership site. You don't have to pay money to belong to that forum. Oh, great. Great question. Any suggestions on how we can convince others, like grant makers or leadership people, or colleagues or reviewers, to accept and find value from small populations and samples? Yes. So my number one suggestion is to really pay attention to do your homework and think through the first two considerations that we talked about. Think through why that person might be afraid of or worried about that small sample size. And if possible, have a conversation with them. Because there is a lot, like small sample sizes are often like the boogeyman of statistics. Like people are afraid of them, but they don't know why. Small sample sizes feel vulnerable. They feel wrong. And that is not a mathematical inevitability. So that's the first thing. Like ground yourself in the fact that small sample sizes aren't scary. They aren't absolutely wrong. Think about the person that you need to convince that this small sample size is actually going to be useful. Think about what question they're trying to answer, what piece of knowledge they're trying to get from this small sample size, and what is it that scares them about the small sample size. And then equip yourself with either an explanation, an example, a resource that you can use as a tool to help calm them down about the fact that they are not going to be in trouble if they fund this small sample size. They are not going to be in trouble if they make meaning from the small sample size. So that's the approach that I would take. And again, big asterisk for privacy. So if you are at risk of exposing private personal information for a person, always err on the side of caution for that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a knee-jerk reaction of not being willing to make meaning for a small group of people because we've been taught that it's wrong. And we haven't considered how important the meaning might be to that small group of people or that small population of people, and that increasing computer power, getting smarter about conventional statistical methods, and developing new statistical methods, they're all happening, and they're all really, really happening around this small population issue. People in the health fields, people in education, people in government, people in big tech, a lot of very hardworking practitioners and smart people are quite aware that if we don't, as a community, get better at making meaning from small sample sizes, we're going to be perpetuating racism. We're never going to know if our programs are really actually working. And if you're in business, you're going to lose money. And so those things are extremely powerful drivers that are leading us to having a lot more resources. Okay, so we try and wrap this up most Fridays at 5 minutes before 1, because we know that it's quite hard on the human brain to have back-to-back meetings, and that a lot of you will have a meeting at 1 o'clock, and lots of you are here on your lunch. And I really, really, really appreciate the fact that so many of you were willing to come out on Zoom. I know that we're not looking for more ways to be on Zoom, are we? So this will be posted in the Data Equity Forum. That is not a membership site. You do not have to pay to watch this video or to share this video. And I know that we didn't get to some of the more technical questions, and we didn't get to some of the really beginner questions, which are both really important. If you still have your question and we didn't get to it, please put it in that forum, and you will, I promise, will get some great answers. And there will be people on your team. You are not alone with your small sample sizes. Okay, so the Zoom link is the same for next Friday. Next Friday, we're going to be talking about Bayesian analysis, which I can see lots of you are already interested in. And we'll cover some of the basics for people who aren't statisticians, have never heard the word Bayesian. And we'll try to touch on some of the more advanced stuff too for people who are struggling with the technical aspects. You are amazing. You have made my week. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And hopefully we'll see you next Friday. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.